So with psilocybin mushroom identification, it's not very hard, but there's one fail-safe rule that you can use to identify psilocybin mushrooms, and that's that all psilocybin mushrooms have a black or dark purple-brown spore print, and then they stain blue where damaged. And so there's nothing without those characteristics together will be poisonous, and they all have psilocybin. Now, some of the mushrooms you won't see very much staining because there's a lot of pigment in them. A lot of them don't have very much psilocin. We'll talk about that in a bit. But here's a bunch of mushrooms that are blue or purple, but they don't have psilocybin. So these mushrooms, they're very blue, but no matter how much you beat them up, they don't get any bluer. And that's how you know that they're not active. This one here has really cool spores on the stem, these orange spores, and it's actually edible. And here's one in Entaloma that I found in Oaxaca. And this one is very blue, but no matter how much you damage it, it doesn't get any bluer. Same with this one. And then Amanita muscaria. This one is psychoactive, but it does not have psilocybin in it. It has a drug called muscimol. And the effects of muscimol are very different than the effects of psilocybin. So different that they never needed to ban it, because when you take it, you kind of punish yourself. It's a lot like alcohol, and that you feel kind of tipsy, you feel really tired. It's probably really good if you can't go to sleep. But it's kind of like a bad Xanax trip. You just don't feel like doing very much. So I recommend people try them, but usually people don't try them twice. But they've never killed anybody, so not super dangerous, but they're nothing like psilocybin mushrooms. Amanita gemata has the same drugs as Amanita muscaria. You'll see these around. They're actually really delicious if you fry them up. The taste is really good. And then Amanita pantherina is a little bit stronger than Amanita muscaria, but also has the drug muscimol in it. And Amanita pantherina always has the collar around the base of the stem there, a distinctive feature of the Amanita pantherina group. So to find psilocybin mushrooms, the first thing you need to do is figure out which mushrooms grow in your area. So you have this list here, and this list I keep up to date, so whenever somebody in some other country finds some psilocybin mushroom, I'll update the list. I usually update it about 20 or 30 times a year. But if you go to that list, it shows every country and every state, and it shows exactly what psilocybin mushrooms are known from there. So once you know which psilocybin mushrooms are in your area, you can look them up. And there's a few ways to do that. Google is a really good resource, but even better is to go to Mushroom Observer or iNaturalist. And these are the citizen science websites where people just upload all their photos there, and then all the users on Mushroom Observer vote on what kind of photo you have. So if you find some mushrooms and you want to figure out, like, what are these? Just add them to Mushroom Observer or iNaturalist. You can even use the iNaturalist app, and you'll get a real good answer real fast if you took good pictures. But also, if you search on Mushroom Observer or iNaturalist for all these names of the psilocybin mushrooms, you'll see the exact locations where they've been found in your area, sometimes with GPS coordinates. And you'll also see the substrates. You'll see like what's in the background, what they grow on, and that's super important. And you will also see what time of year they grow, which in some species is super important, and other species not so much. So then you just wait till it rains, and it's the right time of year, and visit the right habitat, and they will be there. So really common thing to do when you're trying to identify a mushroom is to figure out what color spores it has. And if you're beginning, you're going to want to do a spore print. So what you do is you take a mushroom and you take the cap off and you leave it on tin foil overnight. And then in the morning it would have dropped all its spores, and that color is the spore color. You'll also notice as you get more advanced that the mushrooms start out with kind of cream colored gills, and then the gills turn color to the color of the spores as they mature. But that's kind of subjective sometimes. And then those spore prints, what you can do is put it into a brand new sterile Ziploc bag and save them, or just mail them around the world, and people will happily take them and grow them in their own place. And so you can spread them all around the world that way. Mushroom Observer is my favorite website, and that's where I upload all of my mushroom pictures. So you upload your pictures, everyone votes on what you have, and then you get a permanent record of what's in your area. iNaturalist does the exact same thing, except it's not just for mushrooms. It's for plants and insects and birds and anything alive. And then the best mushroom forum for psychedelic mushrooms is the Shroomery, shroomery.org. And we have this mushroom identification form, which is really good. A lot of the people in there are really smart, and they can point you in the right direction really fast. And then I help run this Facebook forum. It's like a worldwide mushroom identification forum. So if you just have Facebook on your phone and you want to find out what something is, you can get a good answer real fast that way. So there's a bunch of different genera that contain psilocybin. You got Copelandia, and there's 11 of those. There's one in California. And that's kind of an anomaly. I'll show you that in a minute. Galerina is usually deadly. A lot of the people that die from mushroom poisoning die because they eat a galerina. And they look a lot like psilocybin mushrooms, but the spores are a different color, and the texture of the stem is a little bit different. But if you eat them, nothing happens for 12 hours. And then your body gets really sick because you cannot produce any new proteins. And then in about a week, you die. So you definitely want to get a second opinion before you eat something from the wild. Once you get good at it, it's super easy. And then Gymnopilus, we got 13 Gymnopilus with psilocybin, 6 in Inocybe, 3 in Panaeolus, 4 in Foliotina, 6 in Pluteus, and the vast majority are in Psilocybe, 161. So here's all the different psilocybin species in North America. Mexico is the best place in North America, the best place in the world to hunt for psilocybin mushrooms. They got more species of psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico than any other country in the world. So I do a lot of my hunting down there. But California is also very good. And then as you get further north, it gets even better. So Oregon's better than California, and Washington is better than Oregon. So here's the species of psilocybin mushrooms that we get here in California. And I went ahead and moved them all up to the front of the talk since I'm speaking here in Los Angeles. We got Copelandia bispora, Gymnopilus luteifolius, some kind of Panaeolus, Panaeolus cinctulus, Psilocybe allenii, Psilocybe cyanescens, and Psilocybe ovoideocystidiata. But first, I'll talk about Psilocybe cubensis. And Psilocybe cubensis is a mushroom that does not occur in California because it needs the warm subtropical rains. So it's all over Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Mexico, Cuba. It's a name from Cuba, but it's originally from Asia. So when they brought cattle over from Asia, this mushroom came with it. And this is the only mushroom that you can find at a Grateful Dead show because it's so easy to cultivate. It practically grows itself. So anytime you buy mushrooms on the street, you're always getting Psilocybe cubensis, and you'll notice it. It's really distinctive. If you get these other little mushrooms like that people pick wild, they're usually 2 or 3 times stronger than cubensis.
Do you think when they brought it over to Asia, like when I heard that, I'm like, whoa, is that why they think cows are sacred?
Yeah, the question is why are cows sacred in India? Is it because of the mushrooms? And I don't know, but I don't really think so. There's not really any documented use of psilocybe in Asia, but there's a lot of different psilocybe species in Asia, so it's certainly possible.
I watched an entire documentary on why cows are sacred in India, and they serve a wide range of economic functions in Indian culture, and nothing was mentioned about magic mushrooms.
In Asia, they're usually on like elephant manure or water buffalo. But you can see here's where I scratched it, and it's staining blue pretty well right where I scratched it. And then also these have an annulus, so that's the ring on the stem. And then the purple spores fall off of the mushroom and land on the ring. So you really don't have to do a spore print of these because you can just look at the color of the ring, and that's the color of the spores falling off. And here's some that I found in Jalapa, Veracruz. And you can see they're almost always in cow manure, occasionally in horse manure. And here's what it looks like when you grow them. They're super easy to grow. People usually just colonize grain jars and then spawn to core and vermiculite. The whole process takes about 2 months, and there's all sorts of websites that will teach you how to do that. And the spores look really cool, kind of like pumpkin seeds. And here's the habitat where I found a whole bunch in Michoacan. Psilocybe allenii is a psilocybin mushroom that I helped name in 2012. And it's found on wood chips in cities. So this species is almost never found out in the woods. You can walk around the woods for 20 years, you'll never see it. But if you go to like apartment complexes and police stations and libraries and anywhere they put down that kind of wood chip landscaping, you'll find them there. they're a very early season mushroom, so they fruit very quickly. Whenever the first rains come out, you'll fruit thousands of them, and then they're gone by January. So this is one of my spots. This was in Sunnyvale, California, and this place went on for about 80 feet, and just on, just tons of them. And here's a picture that I took right by my house in Oakland just a couple months ago. This spot was also really massive. This is one of those yuppie apartment complexes where, so they just put in all these brand new wood chips, and then they're watering, keeping it irrigated all summer, and I think that really helped because as soon as the temperatures fell in November, just thousands of them came up. And you can see it's right by this ornamental landscaping stuff, right outside someone's window. And then here's another spot I found. These ones were kind of unusually massive and meaty. But somebody told me I just got back from the fungus fair. The Los Angeles Fungus Fair was today. And one guy there finds them all the time in Santa Barbara. And they've been found around here in Los Angeles as well. So when I find them, I take the caps and separate the caps from the stems, and then leave the caps on this piece of tin foil overnight. And then I cover it up with another piece of tin foil to keep them really clean. And then the next morning when I take the tin foil off, the spores drop, and that's the spore print there. So you can see it's a dark purple-brown. And then I cut these up and put them in the brand new Ziploc bag, and that keeps them sterile. And then I can drop them in the mail, and they go all over the world. So this year I mailed out about 500 of them, mostly the United States, but also to places like Russia, Iran, Turkey, South America, just all over the place. So another really common one, which is super similar, is Psilocybe cyanescens. And this one is the one called the wavy cap. The furthest south I've ever found Psilocybe cyanescens was in Escondido. But it definitely grows around here and all up the coast. But it doesn't really grow inland. See, I always find it near the coast. It likes the fog that comes off of the ocean. And so you can see, even when it's kind of young, the cap gets pretty wavy. And it starts out a little bit darker in color than Psilocybe allenii. And the caps are a lot thinner in Psilocybe cyanescens. So like Psilocybe allenii, it's a kind of a thick, meaty mushroom. And this one dries is like feather light. But it's also really potent. People usually take about 1 gram to 1.5 grams of these, whereas with cubensis, they take maybe 3.5 to get the same effect. And sometimes they're really prolific. This is a photo from Germany where you can see thousands of them. They can just really take off through a wood chip bed. And then another one that's not very common in the Bay Area, but gets pretty common down here, is Psilocybe ovoideocystidiata. And so this is another wood chip mushroom, but the thing about it is that it doesn't care about the cold. So a lot of times you need this cold snap to fruit, and so if it doesn't get really cold in November, nothing will fruit. But ovoideocystidiata doesn't care the time of year, it doesn't care the temperature. It'll fruit whenever it rains. And that's allowed it to do really well in Ventura County and lots of other places around here too. People are starting to find them like in industrial parks, like right outside their office window, they say. And Psilocybe ovoideocystidiata is really interesting in that it's the only wood chip mushroom that has an annulus, other than stuntzii, which doesn't grow here. But it's phylogenetically really close to cubensis. So I sequenced the DNA of this, and comes out right over by cubensis in the tree. And we'll see that later. This is a photo from Switzerland. Somebody mailed some spores to Switzerland, and now they're growing all over the place in Switzerland. And he says he keeps finding them 5 or 10 miles from where he planted his spots. And then this photo up here is from my backyard when I used to live down in the South Bay. But you can see they blew really well, and they always have that ring on the stem, and the gills look just a little bit different. And then microscopically, they're way different. Just like 1 second under the microscope, you can tell it from the other ones. It was named Psilocybe ovoideocystidiata after the ovoid chylocystidea, and that's what you see here. So those are the cells on the edge of the gills, and they look like hot air balloons. And then the spores are kind of diamond-shaped, and you don't see that in cubensis or cyanescens or allenii. And then another really cool one, we call it Gymnopilus thursii, or Gymnopilus luteifolius. And this is probably the world's most beautiful psilocybin mushroom. It's not very strong. People have to eat maybe 10 to 20 grams dried, which is a lot. But it looks really cool, and it's pretty common in a lot of places around here. So I find it in wood chips sometimes. This is a wood chip patch by Santa Cruz, and there was just thousands of them, probably 100 pounds of them coming out of that patch. And here's some that I found just a week ago by my house. And it's just a spot where the tree trimming company had dumped a bunch of wood chips in their local park, and was surprised to see these growing in the wood chips. And they do stain blue, but not a whole lot. You really got to beat them up a lot to stain blue. And usually you see the blue stains on the top of the cap. But they start out just bright purple magenta color on the caps, and then they fade to yellow as they mature. And they can get pretty big. And then they say this is the most common psilocybin mushroom in in California. And it's certainly the most common one here in Southern California, Panaeolus cinctulus. So this you'll find in lawns. It's actually really common in lawns. So if you just walk across a lawn, it's always the really green lawns because it likes the lawns to get watered a lot. So if it's really green, that means it's getting really good water year-round. But they're really common there. I find them just all over the place. You have a look-alike with a little bit lighter spores. So this is when you usually do a spore print to try to identify. But it also grows in horse manure. And sometimes when they dump the horse manure in the stables, there'll be like 100,000 of these coming out of a big pile of horse manure. And you can see that it's got this kind of band around the cap, which goes away when it dries. But the gills in this are jet black because it has jet black spores. And the gills are also inquihymuniferous. And that means that the spores mature at a different rate. So you get this mottled look. Any question there?
Is that different than the Liberty Cap?
Yes, it is. The Liberty caps, I moved to the further out in my presentation because you got to drive really far north in California to get to the Liberty caps. But the Liberty cap is Psilocybe semilanceata. But you can see the gills in this always turn charcoal black as the spores mature. And so that's the spore color there. And the look-alike is edible but not hallucinogenic. It's Panaeolus phonosecii. And that one has gills, spores that are like deep walnut brown. So the gills turn really brown but never get this charcoal shade.
When you're harvesting, how much do you leave to sustain the spores to be able to recreate?
You don't really need to leave anything when you're harvesting because the organism is underground. And so most of the organism is in the substrate underground. So it's a good idea to, not to disturb the substrate too much, maybe pinch them off at the base as you pick them. But no matter how many you pick one year, the same amount will come back next year. It doesn't matter if you just leave them to rot or if you take them with you. Pluteus americanus is another one. Pluteus is an exception to the rule with the dark spores. Pluteus has salmon pink spores. So people don't usually recognize it as a magic mushroom, but it does stain blue. Here's a photo from Illinois, and you can see the blue color at the base of the stem there. These are really rare in California. I usually hunt every day and see them about once a year. And when I do see them, they're way too valuable to me to be eating, so I save them for a DNA and microscopic analysis. But they're really cool to see. And this one, we looked at the Thursday already. And that. The last one that grows in Southern California is Copelandia bispora. And this one is a name from Morocco. So it was really surprising to see when I got a call from my friend who lives in Escondido, and they popped up in his garden. And he got a garden full of it. And there were thousands of them just coming up in his garden, which was fertilized with horse manure. So he's a big cultivator, and he started growing it on his balcony. And then he noticed he started seeing it in all of the parks near his house. So now they're kind of getting pretty widespread. And so this is the original find in the garden fertilized with horse manure. And this is a photo that he took from the park in his house. And they're kind of unique in that they stain blue really well, and they have jet black spores, and they have this kind of brown band around the edge of the cap. And then they're named Panaeolus bisporus because each basidia only has 2 spores. So down here, you see this is the basidia, and that's what grows the spores. And then the sterigmata is what attaches the spores. And then here's the spore itself. And there's only 2 spores on the basidia, which is really rare because most mushrooms have 4 spores on each basidia. We saw a Pluteus. So here's some ones that are from the rest of North America. Here's a Psilocybe that is from the White Mountains of Arizona. So you don't think of Arizona as mushroom habitat, but these mountains are really cool. There's beautiful forests there, lots of white fir, lots of pines, lots of poplar. And they catch a lot of rain from the monsoons that come in August. So this is a new species of psilocybin mushroom that my friend Dennis Sharma discovered. And it kind of grows in this really beautiful spot Here's the veil. You can see it's like really coordinate, so really webby-like, and you can already start to see purple spores catching on the veil here. And here's the habitat. So you can see it's absolutely beautiful. There's a creek running through here, and just walking down the creek, you find little patches of these mushrooms for miles. I'm pretty sure it's a new species. I'm currently working on the DNA analysis for that. And then Psilocybe azurescens is the world's most potent psilocybin mushroom. And it's really interesting because the native habitat is really tiny. It only grows next to the ocean, and it only grows within 10 miles of the Oregon-Washington border. So if you go to these places like in Astoria, you'll see all these hippies walking around the sand dunes looking for these mushrooms in the coastal dune grasses. And then you'll see all these rangers with binoculars looking for the hippies. Because the rangers know it's a felony bust up there if they catch anyone picking the mushrooms. And I get messages every day from people that say they got busted out there. So, I tell people, if you're going to go there, you got to be really careful. And you got to, bring a surfboard, a big camera, a binocular, bird book, dogs, whatever. So it doesn't look like you're looking for mushrooms, because they will get you. But these are really cool in that they have this neat umbo, so they kind of look like flying saucers. And they get really tall. So they're very closely related to Psilocybe cyanescens and Psilocybe allenii. And they're pretty easy to cultivate on wood chips. So if somebody mailed some spores down here, you could easily get them going here. You have a question there?
Haven't they spread quite a bit on the border there?
No, I don't think they have spread quite a bit on the border. Yeah, people say that they do, but I've been out there and people have told me like, yeah, we got azurescens down here in Eureka, and I'm like, oh cool, show me. And I go out there, and what they actually had growing in the grasses was Psilocybe allenii. And so, it's really hard to tell Psilocybe azurescens from allenii, especially when they're out there in the grasses, because when you're in the grasses, the stem gets really long, and so it looks like azurescens a lot. They're identical microscopically, so the DNA test is the best way. But I think the natural habitat goes around about 20 miles from the Oregon-Washington border. And certainly, people are spreading them way further than that. There are people finding them in the Bay Area occasionally, but it's always planted patches.
Right. Yeah, that's what I heard.
But if people like in Long Beach are finding these things, I'd like to check the DNA, and I can tell for sure.
Yeah.
Here's some cultivated ones. I think these were cultivated in Europe. These are definitely in Switzerland. And they've escaped into the wild in Portugal, so people are starting to find them in Portugal now. Psilocybe aztecorum is a really unique one. It was named after the Aztecs, and it's only found in the volcanoes that surround Mexico City. So the volcanoes that surround Mexico City are absolutely beautiful. You have Popocatépetl, Nevado de Toluca, Ajusco, and La Malinche. And you only find them above 3,000 meters elevation. So above 3,000 meters, it's really cold. And so they really like the cold, and they only live on the mountaintops. So the native habitat for this mushroom is only a few kilometers in the whole world. But if you go there in September, it can be the most common mushroom out there. And the people in Mexico, for the most part, have not learned about these very much. So you're right by Mexico City with all those people that would like to find them, but there's no one from Mexico City out there looking for them.
That's aztecorum.
What's that?
That's Psilocybe
aztecorum, yeah. And I sequenced the DNA on this one and got a really big surprise. It's really closely related to Psilocybe cerbica, which is from Europe. And it's the only psilocybin mushroom in Mexico that's related to any of the European species.
So, but I think aztecorum, like if you look at the Life magazine, it has the whole little field guide in the middle of it,
Yeah.
1956. Aztecorum is one of the species that was...
It's one of the early ones that was discovered. Yeah.
Identified, right?
Yeah, they would go to Popocatépetl.
Don't know about it? I mean,
The word just never really spread about it. And it's not a very big assuming mushroom, and it doesn't stain blue because it's got more psilocybin than psilocin. So the psilocin is what causes the blue staining, but both psilocybin and psilocin are hallucinogenic. So if they have a lot of psilocybin but not much psilocin, then you can beat them up, and if you have a big pile of mushrooms, you'll see a little blue somewhere, but there won't be very much. If you just find one or two, half the time there won't be any blue. But it's also like really high elevation there. It's not like down where people can get to them really easily. They're really at the top of the mountains. And they have these cool white rhizomorphs at the base of the stem. And here's the habitat. So the trees here are Pinus hartwegii. It's the really high elevation Mexican pine. And then you find them growing out of the pine cones under those trees and under pine sticks and grass. And then this shrub is Senecio cineroides, and I really like that shrub too. It's kind of a silvery looking shrub. So as soon as we start seeing those silvery shrubs, we know it's time to get out and look. You've gone high enough. Psilocybe beocystis is a really tiny one that's really strong. The common name is the potent psilocybe. And it grows in Oregon and Washington. And it's really unique in that it has this crazy scalloped margin on the edge. And it grows both in grass and in wood chips. And certainly could be cultivated here too, just the spores aren't here yet. And then Psilocybe banderiensis. This is a really hard one to find because it's really dark in color, and it only grows in the cloud forests of Veracruz and Oaxaca. So these cloud forests are really cool. They're some of the most diverse habitats in the country, and that's why you find so many psilocybin mushrooms there. And by every afternoon, about 3 p.m., the clouds roll in and bring lots of humidity. And so these forests are really dark, really neat places to go. And you can see the cap on this is so dark and the stems are so dark too that I've never seen this stain blue. But I know if you found a really young one that hadn't turned dark yet and you beat it up, it would stain blue because they taste pretty strong, they smell pretty strong. All of the psilocybin mushrooms have this cucumber odor, but then other species have other odors on top of it. Some of them smell like cucumber with radish on top. And you can see these are pretty young. The spores are not mature yet, so the gills are still cream colored. But if I had left those out there and come back in a week, then those gills would be dark purple brown. Psilocybe caerulescens. This is a group of mushrooms that are found mostly in Mexico and Central South America. And they call them derumbes. And derumbes means landslide in Spanish. So they found these actually in landslides. This is the only derumbe that occurs in the United States as well. It's turned up in Georgia. In fact, Paul Stamets found it in Georgia, and he named it Psilocybe wiley. But it was actually described in 1923 from Alabama. And it's also turned up in Texas, Louisiana, and South Carolina. So here's the signs the Mexican government puts up to alert you that there's landslides in the area. So when we see signs like this, if it's a cloud forest, we'll stop, and there's usually like a creek at the bottom of the landslide. So that's some of the most dangerous mushroom hunting you can do because it's extremely unstable and the storms are coming in. And it's very rewarding, though. These things are really beautiful. So here's a picture that I took about 6 months ago, and this was in Volcán de Fuego, which is the active volcano that's right on the border between Colima and Jalisco. And so they have these dry stream beds there in Volcán de Fuego, and you walk along the dry stream beds, and in the middle there's no mushrooms, and then in the very edges, like up into the jungle, there's like little tiny mushrooms, but then in the walls of the dry stream bed, you'll find Psilocybe caerulescens. And you can walk for miles and miles up these dry stream beds, and they just keep going, just finding patches and patches every couple hundred yards. And then this is a spot in Jalisco that I call the sawmill, because 15 years ago it was a sawmill, and it was shut down. And now it's just full of psilocybe. There's like way more than anybody could possibly carry. And so there's hundreds of Mexican hippies looking for the spot. Nobody's found it yet. It's mostly Psilocybe caerulescens there, but also Psilocybe zapotecorum occurs there, and some other ones too. And we went there, and we found maybe 100 pounds of these Psilocybe caerulescens, so we just piled them up into a big pile. And then the landowner came, and he's like, "Hey, what are you guys doing here?" And my friend's like, "Oh, we're looking for mushrooms." And he's like pointing off at the hills, trying to explain where the mushrooms were. And I got a picture of him doing that. But the guy's like, "Oh, that's so cool. I can't believe you came all the way from the United States to look for our mushrooms here. You guys come back whenever you want. The house is never locked. Make yourselves at home." And so now I come back there every year, and we stay in the little house. And it's a really good spot. And that's because it used to be a sawmill, and they just dumped all the bark and all the wood chips, and now it's just decomposing, mountains and mountains of these. And so like, as it decomposes, the psilocybes turn these wood chips back into good dirt. Yep?
What type of wood?
The wood in that area is a mix sort of conifer and hardwood. So most psilocybes like to grow in hardwood, like oak or alder. But conifer has a lot of tannins in it, a lot of oils that are antifungal. But after a couple of years, those oils leach out in the rain. So after a while, conifer does work, but not nearly as well as oak or alder. Birch is really good. Maple is really good. This is one that I found in a landslide. And here's a spore print on the top of it. The spore print was just left by some grass that was laying across the top of the cap. And here's the original, the first time I found this spot. This is what we had in front of us when the farmer guy came and was like, hey, what are you guys doing? But luckily, he's like, oh, I love mushrooms, and he eats them for dinner all the time. He has no idea that his land is full of psilocybe. And this is the habitat in Volcán de Fuego, the border of Colima and Jalisco. And this is Cactu, my friend Fulvio, and he's the person who introduced me to mushroom hunting in Mexico. So in 2007, he was finding Psilocybe zapaticorum and Psilocybe sabrulescens, and he was posting photos on the shroomery. And that's right when I was just getting started, and I had never seen psilocybin mushrooms that size, because in the United States, our psilocybin mushrooms are little. They're very strong, but they're small. Whereas some of these psilocybin mushrooms, they can be 6 inches or a foot tall. And so I messaged him, and I'm like, hey, can I come mushroom hunting in Mexico with you? And he's like, yeah. So I flew into Guadalajara. And he was a really nice guy, super cool, spoke English really well, and a biologist. And so within an hour of getting off the plane, I was in his Psilocybe sabrulescens patch. And I was pretty hooked on Mexican mushrooms from that moment. So I've been going back every year since 2007. And it turns out that as soon as the rains stop in the United States, the rains start in Mexico. So United States season goes up about till July. And then you can go to Mexico and hunt from July all the way, or June through October, November. And then as soon as the rains start here, it's time to come back. Here's some police looking at Psilocybe sabrulescens. This is at the Fungus Fair in Sengyu, Michoacan. Luckily, these guys are not very good at microscopic identification because they did not arrest me. But these police are actually really nice. They always make fun of me for finding magic mushrooms, and I make fun of them for being corrupt. And they're like, yeah, it's true. If I'm hungry and I need a taco, I'll pull somebody over. Psilocybe caerulescens, this is a species that was described from Michigan. And it also turns up in Mexico, too. So it grows on beech wood. And there's not very many beaches left in Mexico. Mexico used to be covered in beaches, and then the Ice Age came and changed the climate drastically, like 10,000 years ago. Now there's just some isolated pockets of beach in Veracruz and Hidalgo. But when I went there looking for this mushroom, I found it the first day I was looking for it. So it's not common and it's not rare, but really only on beechwood. In this country, it grows all over the east. This is the one they call the bluefoot. And it also likes birch a lot, too. So people usually just look for beech forests. It grows all the way from New York to Michigan and all of those eastern states. But it's really small. It's not very common. You can see this is a primordium. It starts out like that. This thing's blue pretty good. And then this is Alonso Cortez Perez. He's really cool. He was studying with Gaston Guzman, who passed away a couple years ago. But Gaston was the world authority on Psilocybe. So I used to go all over Mexico collecting Psilocybe, and then I'd bring them to Gaston Guzman and give them to him, and he would get them studied. Now Alonso is the world expert in Psilocybe, so I go take him all over Mexico. And we find a lot of really cool stuff. He's a very sharp mycologist. And he's the one that spotted this. His eyes are amazing. Psilocybe cyanofibrillosa is really rare. You find it only in Washington, maybe northern Oregon. It's only been found a few times in the history of humanity. And we're lucky to have pictures of it. And Workman's this guy in the shroomery. He does a lot of the microscopy on a lot of these. So he looks at all the cells on the gills and puts together these nice composite images. Psilocybe fagicola. This one grows in the cloud forests of Oaxaca and Veracruz. It's kind of rare. I've seen it a few times. Psilocybe hopii was recently described from the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona. And it's really unusual to hear of any mushrooms out that way. And so I messaged the guy that discovered it, and I'm like, hey man, can I come mushroom hunting with you and try to get photos of Psilocybe hopii? I never expected him to respond, but he did. He's like, oh yeah, I follow you on Facebook. Yeah, that'd be awesome. And so went out there and found them. And it wasn't fruiting all that well when we got there, but there was a few good specimens. And so, Arizona is mostly really dry, but the San Francisco Peaks gets really good rain because it's a really tall mountain right by Flagstaff. And, the rain clouds come off of the Gulf and hit that mountain and drop all the rain right there. So you get really cool stuff there. And then Psilocybe hugioginii, var hugioginii, this is probably the world's coolest looking psilocybin mushroom. And it took me 10 years to find it because it's so crazy looking. There weren't any good photos of them, just really blurry photos. And I really wanted to find it, so I went to Oaxaca and started looking. And I would spend 2 or 3 months out of the year looking, and I couldn't find it until this summer. We went to this place that's super remote. It's called Sierra Mije. And Sierra Mije is so far away that nobody really goes to it. All the tourists go like closer places. So they had never seen anyone from the United States or anything like that. And the people ended up being really friendly there. They were super nice. And we camped out in the morning. We found this landslide and looked at it and found these. So Psilocybe hugioginii has a really acute umbo. And hoping to get DNA sequencing results on this soon so I can figure out where to put it. Here's one that was collected by Gordon Wasson in 1959. And I found this in the herbarium in Mexico City. And so I went to Mexico City hoping to be able to study the psilocybe in the herbarium, but I just showed up like some random guy on the street. And I said, hey, can I come study your mushrooms to the curator there? And he's like, yeah, of course. What do you want to see? And I said, psilocybe. And he's like, okay. And so he gives me a microscope and shows me these 2 big cabinets full of psilocybe. And he's like, okay, go ahead. And so for 2 weeks, I would go there every day and study all the collections. And this is where Paul Stamets was sending all of his collections. So like a lot of his were from 1977, 1978. He sent hundreds of mushrooms to Mexico City where they still are, and anybody can go study them there. And here's one that came from Maria Sabina, also in that same herbarium.
I was just about to ask if you guys know what species she was using.
Yeah, so she is from Huautla de Jimenez, which is in the Sierra Mazateca of Oaxaca. And it's a crazy place for many reasons. But it's a pretty good cloud forest, except that they cut it all down. So when they cut down the trees, the mushrooms don't like that at all, because they really like diversity. So you can go there and find psilocybe, and I found a lot there, but it takes a lot of walking, and it's not an easy place. But she was very fond of Psilocybe hugioginii, Psilocybe youngensis, Psilocybe zapaticorum is probably the main one that she was using, but also Psilocybe caerulescens, and Psilocybe cubensis, and Psilocybe mexicana. So this is the first place that people from the United States knew that there were psilocybin mushrooms, so a lot of these species got described there. So when I find them there, then I can be like, okay, I know for sure this is the one they were talking about because it's from the same spot and it matches the description. So then I make DNA sequences of that and get those into GenBank. So then when people want to compare their DNA to these species, they're like, oh, okay, this is the right DNA sequence because it's from the exact place that it was discovered. So this is the spot that I found the Psilocybe hugioginii. You see, I was pretty happy to find it. Psilocybe meridionalis is the only one in this talk that I've never found, but I've spent a long time looking for it. It was really recently described. It's the newest psilocybin mushroom in Mexico, discovered in 2005, a place known as Sierra de Cacoma. And so I went to Sierra de Cacoma and couldn't find it, so I went to the herbarium to see if there was anything in the notes of the holotype collection that would give me a clue as to where they found it. And it turns out there was. So this is the holotype collection here. So when you discover a new species of mushrooms, you make a good collection, and that collection gets saved forever. And then whenever anyone else has a question about that name, they study your holotype collection to know, okay, this is the mushroom that is attached to that name. So you can go to these herbariums and request the holotypes. And when you open up the box, there's all these notes. And the cool thing about these notes, there's not only a description, but they have GPS coordinates written down of where they found it. So I went back to the spot when I had the GPS coordinates and couldn't find it. It was a little bit dry, so I got to keep going. But I'll probably find it eventually. But it's super rare. It's only been found once from just the holotype collection, nothing else. And also recently described from New Mexico was Psilocybe mescaleroensis. And so that was discovered by Lee Wallstad. And I was going to do the psilocybe tour of the Southwest. So I messaged Lee Wallstad. I Googled him and turned out he found him on YouTube, and he was like talking about his free energy machine. And I'm like, oh, there he is. And so I messaged him on YouTube, and I couldn't believe that he responded. And he's like, yeah, let's go mushroom hunting. And so I go out there, and this guy is definitely something else. He makes a lot of free energy machines and stuff like that. And he was pretty difficult to work with. He's a nice guy, but difficult. And after a few days, he finally took us out to the spot where he discovered them. And it's really high in elevation. It's really cold up there. And we found him up there. And they have an annulus on the stem, one of the few psilocybes that does have a ring on the stem. And they're stained blue pretty well. And this is the habitat. And I'm pretty sure they only grow in one mountain in the world because it's like a desert island, whereas you have all this rain and all these nice Engelmann spruce up there. And then you go down in elevation and it's all desert. So it's surrounded by desert, and the spores can't really get to any other places. So that's how they remain very rare and very unique and unable to spread to anywhere else. Psilocybe mexicana. This one grows all over Mexico, and it also was found in Florida. And when they found it in Florida, they called it Psilocybe tampanensis. But it's the same as mexicana. It's also been found in Georgia and Louisiana, Guatemala, Nicaragua. But in central Mexico, it's pretty common. And this is one of the strongest psilocybin mushrooms. This summer, I ate 16 caps, and the caps are so small, they dry down to like almost nothing. But 16 caps were really strong. So these I found in La Primavera, which is the park above Guadalajara. And they have a really unusually strong odor. It's probably the strongest odor of any psilocybin mushroom, in that they are, like all psilocybin mushrooms, they smell like cucumber, but these smell like just really strong like cucumber. And so there's a lot of little brown mushrooms that grow in the grass, but none of them have an odor like this. And they have a lot of psilocybin, but very little psilocin, so you very rarely see them stained blue. But if you got a few hundred of them, you'll be able to find some blue on one or two of them. So they're always in grassland, and they like places that have horses and sheep, but never directly from dung. It's always directly from the grass, but might have some association with the animals too. You get this really cool coordinate veil that you can already see the purple spores landing on. Psilocybe mulliricula is another one of these in the Durumbe group. This is the really high elevation Durumbe. So these landslide mushrooms usually are down at lower, more tropical places, but Psilocybe mulliricula grows from 2,200 to 3,500 meters, and up there, especially at the top of the range, it's super cold. So this is Popocatépetl. It's an active volcano in the state of Puebla. And I went there to check my Psilocybe mulliricula spot, and the police stopped me and turned me around, said, sorry, it's too dangerous. The volcano's erupting right now, and we can't let you pass. So I turned around and I snuck in through Puebla, and I was able to get this picture. But this is actually, it's erupting here. There's a cloud over it, and it's like erupting at the moment. And this is the habitat that it grows in. So this is like a dry stream bed. It's all very dark volcanic ash type soil. And you'll find them on the edges. So like these vertical walls that are really sandy is where they come out. Here's one of the vertical walls here. And I found them right at sunset, and I'm like, oh, well, I'll just come back in the morning and photograph them. That was a really bad idea because a storm came in that night. In the morning, they were just beat to hell and just almost all washed away. But that's where they were anyway. And here's some from Nevada de Toluca. I've also found them in Veracruz. And they have this cool flocose mycelium in the bottom half of the stem, and then the top of the half is pruinose. So that means kind of powdery looking. And if you look at the caps here, the gills, they're like really cream colored. So it's really unusual in psilocybe, but in these, the spores don't mature until they get really old. So they eventually turn purple, but it takes like 2 weeks. And then Psilocybe neohalapensis, this is one that's named after Jalapa. So it's in the cloud forests. And it's really cool looking. And it's really strong. It has the odor of cucumber and of oil paints. So both odors together. And this, you've almost never see staining blue, even though it's really strong, because there's so much pigment in the mushroom that this dark brown pigment kind of overshadows any blue that might shine through. And you can see the gills are cream colored when it's young and then turn purple when it gets old. And here's the habitat, kind of like, most psilocybe is grown in human habitats, either in manure or in wood chip landscaping or disturbed areas in the landslides, but these do not. These you'll find in the middle of the most pristine forests, and so it's an interesting ecological niche. Psilocybe pelliculosa grows on the coast, all the way from Washington down through California. I think the furthest south it's ever been found is Salt Point State Park in Sonoma County, and I found it there this year. So here's my picture from Salt Point, and when I found it, I didn't think that it grew down there, so I didn't really know what I found, but I brought it back and I sequenced the DNA, and it matched perfectly with the Psilocybe pelliculosa. And sometimes people find just thousands of these in clear cuts. There can be 100,000 fruit bodies. But they look a lot like Gallerina. If you know what Gallerinas look like, they look almost exactly like that. But if you look here, you can see there's dark purple-brown spores that are on the veil remnants on the stem, whereas Gallerina has rusty spores. So by paying attention to little things like that, you won't get confused. Psilocybe cubensis is a name from Quebec, and it grows also in Michigan, and recently it turned up in Colorado. So here's the caerulescens on it. I used this 100,000 microscope at Merritt College. So this is what the edge of the gill looks like. But in psilocybe taxonomy, this caerulescens is super taxonomically significant. So if you want to identify which psilocybe you have, and you're not really familiar with the area, you always have to look at these microscopic features. And then once you do that a few times, then you just recognize them. When you see them, you're like, oh yeah, it's going to look like that. But here it grows on decaying wood, has strong rhizomorphs at the base of the stem. Psilocybe semilanceata, this is the one that people call liberty caps. And it grows in California, but only far north California. So people are always telling me they found liberty caps in Santa Cruz, and they always found Satharella or something. But I found a whole bunch. This is now the type species of psilocybe, so this is like the species that the whole genus is anchored to. And it's the most widely distributed species of psilocybe. It grows all over Australia, all over Europe, all over all sorts of temperate areas. So it grows in the grass. It likes sheep and horse fields, but it doesn't grow directly from manure. And looks really cool sometimes. And this one is very high in psilocybin, but very low in psilocin. So that means it almost never stains blue, though occasionally you'll find one or two blue caps. So if you head up Highway 101, go north of Eureka, there's this place. It says like Elk Crossing, and it's like Redwood National Park. And there's all these elk in there in the field. And we stopped there, and the field was just full of Psilocybe semilanceata. And there were some hippie-looking guys there also kind of walking and stooping over. And we're like, hey, what are you guys doing? And they said, oh, we're tracking animals. God, very creative. We're tracking animals too. They look really cool in the microscope. This is the caerulescens here, and the spores there. Psilocybe stuntzii is one that has an annulus, but it's actually really closely related to the liberty caps. And it gets really rare the further south you go. So I've hunted in the bay for a long time, and I've never seen it. But I have seen definitely seen some collections from the Bay Area, so it is there. It's probably here too, but it's not common. It grows both in lawns and in wood chip landscaping. It looks a lot like Psilocybe ovoideocystidiata because they both have an annulus. But ovoideocystidiata has a much whiter stem and a lighter colored cap. This often has this dark colored cap and a reddish stem. So they call these blue ringers, and the reason is a lot of times the annulus itself will stain blue from the psilocin oxidation. And Psilocybe subtropicalis is one that I find in Veracruz, Oaxaca. It also turns up in Guatemala. And this one is the only one that I find in Mexico that really likes oak trees. Usually when I find psilocybes in Mexico, they're kind of in conifer-type forests. But found these a bunch of times under oaks in Jalapa and also in Huautla de Jimenez in Oaxaca. So when I collect mushrooms, I put them in these tackle boxes, so that keeps them from getting crushed and keeps all the collections separate. And then I can bring them back and then put them in paper bags. And then I write the photo number of the camera onto the bag, so I always know which dried mushrooms go with which pictures. Toss them on the dashboard and then dry them that way. because they say that when you have photos with no dried specimen, it's just a rumor. And that's really true. If you discover a new psilocybin mushroom and you don't save anything dried, you come to a mushroom expert and tell them, they'll be like, yeah, it's not going to help much to see that picture. I got to see the dried material. So study the microscopic features and get the DNA out. So if you do find some psilocybin mushroom that you think might be new, definitely dry it, save it, and don't get it mixed in with all your other mushrooms. Psilocybe youngensis is one that grows in Mexico and more tropical areas, and it grows directly from wood. And this is one of my favorite ones to photograph. It's a picture from Jalisco. And it grows on really well-decayed wood, so like oak logs. And sometimes there's thousands of them. And then in the very corner of this picture, you can see a little bit of an umbrella stick. So what I did to take this picture is I set up my tripod in the river, and then I put a white umbrella to stop the sunlight so you don't get any harsh shadows. And then just here, right underneath, right out of the frame, there was a big silver reflector bouncing up light. So that's why you have light here in the upper stem. You can actually see the gills are not in a shadow. And then I set the camera to like f16, ISO 100, like 2-second exposure. And when you do all that, the photos turn out really well. And here's what they look like when they're really young. And then when you get old, they look like that. And then the last one in psilocybe that I'll talk about is Psilocybe zapoticorum. This is the most common derumbe in Mexico. It's one of the stronger psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico, one of the more popular ones. I stopped by Maria Sabina's compound a couple years ago, and this is the only one they had for sale there. Just like a big basket full of it. It's also really popular in like San Jose del Pacifico and some of these other places in Oaxaca. But in Oaxaca, I never find very many because everybody in Oaxaca knows what Psilocybe zapoticorum looks like. Whereas people in Jalisco and Michoacan, they don't know what it looks like, and the only people that are hunting for it out there are my friends that are biologists. So trying to teach people all over Mexico what this looks like. But this is a photo from that sawmill. And you can see it's really fun to photograph. These are about 8 inches tall. And they have these really cool squamulose stem. And you can see, lots of fibers in here, a little bit of blue staining. And they grow sometimes in clusters of up to 100. Here's a picture from Michoacan. And they really like to be near water. So we had to go down into water to photograph this little group right in here. And this is the group they were photographing above the water. We thought it was so beautiful that we're just like, oh, we can't pick these. We'll leave them here. But a couple hours later, we were hunting edibles a little bit up the mountain. And somebody says, Alan, I look over, and there's these hippie guys that we know from Guadalajara. And this exact cluster of mushrooms was in the back of their car. But they were really cool. You know, we didn't mind. We're just like, oh, you found the spot. That's cool. It's all friends of Fulvio's. So all of Fulvio's friends know all these spots, and they all go out there and hunt, but pretty much nobody else. Here's what happens if you take a younger one and you squeeze it. So they have a ton of psilocybin and a ton of psilocin. So that makes the blue staining really intense. And since the spores were not mature yet, the gills were still cream colored, so I was able to show the blue really well. Here's a picture that I took just this summer at the sawmill. You can see the spore color really well on these. And this is the habitat. So super dangerous places. You know, there's all loose rocks. It's all on just such a steep angle that it's all just about to fall. And then you go down to the bottom of them. And bottom of these landslides near the river to hunt for these things. But it's really rewarding. It's some of my favorite mushroom hunting in the world, probably because it is so dangerous. This is another spot. This is my spot in Michoacan. And this is right near where they have the fungus fair in Sangyu. This is the next town over in Aparo. And so I always pick these mushrooms there and put them on display. And then the police always make fun of me. And then here's the spore prints. So I brought them back and just working on them in the lab, doing DNA analysis and stuff like that. So that's everything for psilocybe, but there's also psilocybin and a few other genera. So I just got a couple species in here that are not from psilocybe. And it's really interesting how the psilocybin got there. we always assumed that psilocybin was so useful that it evolved several times in these different genera of mushrooms, which are not closely related at all. Turns out that they did full genome sequencing on several of these psilocybin mushrooms from different genera and found that the genes that were producing psilocybin were exactly the same. And that means that they did not evolve separately. They actually got transferred from one genus to another through horizontal gene transfer. And it's not known how that happened, but like horizontal gene transfer is what Monsanto does to put like pesticides into crops and stuff like that. But it also happens in nature too occasionally. And it could be that the mushrooms got physically mashed together, and when the mushrooms repaired the DNA, it just kind of spliced together the DNA from other species. But it's more likely that a virus or some kind of bacteria moved the DNA. Nobody knows why nobody knows why psilocybin mushrooms produce psilocybin. There's not really a lot of advantage to deterring animals because mushrooms generally want to attract animals to spread the spores. And,
What if it's a way to simply communicate with us also?
what's that?
What if it's a way simply to communicate with us?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't think that mushrooms know we're here, but I could be wrong. I don't think they think in those terms. And people have only been using psilocybin mushrooms in the Western world for about 70 years. But then in these 5 mountains of Oaxaca, they've definitely been using them for thousands of years. But they've evolved all over the world kind of independently of human knowledge of them. So it might just be kind of random in that they just, as long as this molecule is not an evolutionary disadvantage, it makes them. Nobody really knows. But in any case, it's a highly medicinal compound and super valuable. Works way better for depression than anything you can get at a pharmacy. So it's good that it's there. Here, Copelandia cyanescens always grows on cow manure, and it has jet black spores. And I find it in pretty tropical areas like Jalisco. It grows all over Texas and Florida. And this is a photo that I took in my friend's closet. This is down in Sunnyvale, so these things are pretty easy to grow. They're kind of tropical species, so he has a heating pad underneath to keep it at about 80 degrees. And here's one I found in Querétaro, and you can see I broke the stem, and it turns really, really blue.
Testing these things, I've looked up this question before and got some weird answers. Is the stem and the cap different potencies?
The stem and the cap both have lots of psilocybin. I think the cap has maybe a tiny bit more, but it makes sense to just use the whole thing.
I have another
Yep.
question in terms of the chemical components. I know some people, when they're doing work with the mushroom, like personal work, they'll actually invest it. People who like to party, like doing tea. Is there a difference in the chemical compounds someone's ingesting in terms of what they're having in tea?
It's pretty much the same thing. These alkaloids that are psychedelic are water soluble, so water is really good solvent for extracting them. So if you make a whole bunch of mushroom tea and then you just scoop the mushrooms out of the bottom and eat them, you'll find nothing at all happens. So it goes into solution really well. But I think mushroom teas are really good, especially with fresh ginger, because the ginger will settle your stomach. And your whole digestive system runs on serotonin. 80% of the serotonin in your body is in the gut. So I think when you eat these mushrooms, they interact with your serotonin receptors, and they kind of confuse your gut a little bit, and that's why you feel kind of queasy. So some fresh ginger could help. But tea also makes it so that the psilocybin and psilocin goes into your blood a lot faster. So it hits you a lot faster, and then it wears off more quickly. And that's good sometimes. Yeah, yeah. And here you can see the spores are just starting to develop, so they're just starting to turn black in the gills there. And then Philiotina smithii. This is the one that used to be called Canosobe smithii, but it got kicked out of Canosobe into Philiotina, but it's going to be kicked out of Philiotina because it turns out that when I sequenced these, I found that they were not close to the type species of Philiotina. So the type species of Philiotina anchors Philiotina in one spot in the phylogenetic tree, and these are in this other completely different clade, so they're going to get a new name eventually. But it really likes cold temperatures, so you see it all along the Canada-United States border. It's in all the northern states, but doesn't make its way down into California. But these, they look really scary because they look like deadly mushrooms. A lot of the deadly gallerinas, they have these orange spores, and these have bright orange spores. They also look like the really poisonous, like Canosobe phalaris, which are deadly poisonous and look really, really similar. But the difference is these have a little bit whiter of a stem than the deadly ones, which have a slightly less white stem. And these stain blue, especially at the base of the stem. Gymnopilus luteus is all over the eastern United States. It's not very strong, but it makes up for that in being really common and really big. So you'll find these sometimes as covering logs. And they taste really bitter, but people say that they have a really good effect if they eat enough. And then the last mushroom I have, Pluteus saupe. This was found in Chicago. It's super rare. There's a few of these really rare Pluteus in California as well. Here we got like Pluteus phaeocyanopus and a couple other ones. So here's a couple slides on the people that study psilocybe. There's only a few of us in the world that actually publish on psilocybe. And most people that like lose their job at their institution if they were to study illegal mushrooms. But we're all friends and they're all really cool people. This is Virginia Ramirez on the left and Alonso Cortez Perez on the right. And Virginia did her PhD thesis on the molecular phylogeny of psilocybe. So she was the first person to generate lots of DNA sequences and figure out how they all fit together into the whole tree of life. And then Alonso was studying with Gaston Guzman for a long time. And so he does all of the microscopy down in the Jalapa Herbarium on the psilocybe. So he's studied the holotype collections of a lot of species of psilocybe, and it takes him about a day to thoroughly study microscopically each collection. So he's spent just thousands of days looking at the microscope. And so when I go to Mexico, I bring a microscope with me and just show it, show the stuff to him, and just within seconds he knows what everything is. And then this is Laura Guzman here, and she's the daughter of Gaston Guzman. She is super cool, and she's a mycology teacher in Guadalajara, University of Guadalajara. So whenever I go to Guadalajara, I always go there. I think I gave this talk at the University of Guadalajara this summer in Spanish. And she's a really excellent teacher. She's super patient, and she's very knowledgeable, and very, it's like everything that she does is perfect as far as like her work that she turns out. So I'm working on her and publishing all of Gaston Guzman's papers, and that's a lot of papers, a lot to go through, but she's super cool. So if you're in Guadalajara, you should stop by that university. And she runs the herbarium there too, so you can go and study all the holotypes and all the other collections that have been saved there, like a library for dried mushrooms. And this is Jan Borovichka. This guy's really cool. He lives in Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia is one of the few countries in the world where psilocybin mushrooms are not illegal. Yeah. And they're not really a big deal in Czechoslovakia. Like, they don't really cause problems. They sell them in stores, and it's just normal. So he does a lot of molecular work with psilocybe too. And in 2012, I published Psilocybe allenii with him. And we continue to do molecular work on the phylogeny of psilocybe. So this molecular work used to be really expensive and really hard to do. But now anybody can do it in their kitchen for about $1,000. So what you do is you extract the DNA, and I usually do that with sodium hydroxide. And then you run a PCR reaction. That stands for polymerase chain reaction. And all that is a machine that heats up and cools down your sample and copies the DNA. And then you do gel electrophoresis to see if the PCR reaction worked. And if it did, then you drop it off at a DNA sequencing place, or drop it in the mail, and they put it into the sequencer. So there's this black box in Berkeley, and if I get my DNA into that box by 6 p.m., I get my results the next morning about 5 a.m. And the results are a text file. It's about 700 characters long. And then you paste that into BLAST. And BLAST is run by the US government. One of the really cool things that they do is they run GenBank and BLAST. And so I paste my DNA sequence in there, and a few seconds later, it shows me all of the exact matches, which means that it shows me exactly where in the world this mushroom that I just sequenced is also found. And then it shows all of the other closely related species. So you download all the sequences from all the closely related species, and then you can calculate a phylogenetic tree. And that's where you get to see exactly how your mushroom fits into the whole tree of life. And these phylogenetic trees are really new, especially in psilocybe. It's only been doing them for a few years, but it's completely switched around the way that we thought that the genus was organized. And every time I get a new species that's not in GenBank yet, that I check the DNA on, it's always really interesting to see where it falls out. And half the time it falls out where I predicted it would fall out. And the other half of the time it comes out somewhere completely somewhere else, and I'm like, oh, that can't be right. But then I look at it and start looking at the microscopic features, and I'm like, wait, oh, it does fit in really well over there. So this is Counterculture Labs in Oakland, and this is the biohacker space, just like a mile from my house. And really cool place. It's a big laboratory, and it's open to the public, so we do all sorts of cool science stuff there.
That's at the Omni, right?
It's at the Omni, yeah. The same room as Pseudo Room, the other regular hackerspace. And so here we're doing DNA extraction, just getting the DNA of the mushrooms into solution. And here's PCR, and she is setting up a PCR reaction on ice because when you start mixing the chemicals, it all starts reacting, and you don't want it to react before you get it into the PCR machine. So we mix everything on ice and then put it directly from the ice into the machine. And here's the electrophoresis gel. So she is pipetting the samples that came out of the PCR machine into the gel, and it's actually a piece of Jell-O. And then you run 100 volts DC through that gel, and it pulls the DNA towards the positive, and you put it on a black light and get your result. And so here's the result of the final phylogenetic tree that I calculated. And so up here you have a lot of the Mexican stuff. Psilocybe mexicana, caerulescens turned out to be really close to mexicana. That was a really big surprise because people always thought the caerulescens was in this complete other section. And you get some of the other Mexican stuff mixed in with stuff from Thailand there. And then down here you have like Psilocybe allenii, Psilocybe cyanescens, right next to Psilocybe subaeruginosa from Australia and Psilocybe azurescens from Oregon. So this whole group here, they're all wood chip species, and they all require really cold fruiting temperatures, and they're all extremely potent. And then up here you have Psilocybe cubensis, and it's right next to the species from Nepal and some from China, and pretty close to ovoideocystidiata. So these ones in here, they're not as potent, but they don't need that cold snap to fruit. They will fruit at any temperature. And then you get some of there's one Mexican one that here, the Aztecorum, was the one from the tops of the volcanoes, and it's really far from the rest of the Mexican ones. So this one's really unique. And then here's some of the European stuff in here. So every time I get a new sequence, I'll add it to this tree and see where it falls out. So that's just about all I have for you. I'll just tell you about my favorite mushroom websites and then take some questions. My favorite website is mushroomobserver.org because I upload all of my pictures on there, and then they save the high-resolution copy of it, so I can always give people the highest resolution image that came right off the camera. But also, everyone else votes on what kind of mushroom you have there. And the people that vote are really into mushrooms, so they're really good, especially at figuring out what a mushroom is, even if the picture is blurry or you don't see the underside or something like that. They're really sharp. And then you have the Shroomery, Mushroom Identification Forum. So that's obviously magic mushroom focused and really cool group of people. And then the book, the Bible on psilocybe, is called The Genus Psilocybe by Gaston Guzman. It's really difficult to read because it's highly technical, and a lot of the species in there are actually synonyms. And now that we're doing all this DNA sequencing, we're noticing that a lot of the species in there are actually not different, but that makes it easier to key stuff out. Then you have Mycotopia, another psilocybe form. And I have the list of which psilocybin mushrooms grow in your area. And then I got my YouTube channel, so I put a lot of my videos on there. And Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World by Paul Stamets is the only book that you can buy in a bookstore that's any good about this stuff. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions.